Welcome everyone to the 44th Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I am your host, as always, Joseph Pochgay Alvarez from the University of Osaka. And I'm delighted to be joined today by our kind presenter, James Anderson from the World Bank, who will be talking to us about how does measuring corruption look like from the perspective of economics publication. He published a report with the World Bank earlier this year about the topic, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from his insights. Before we begin, just a couple of things about how the roundtable will be conducted. We'll have allotted about 90 minutes. It will not be divided between presentation and Q&A, but rather if at any point during the presentation you have questions or comments about the specific point being discussed, don't feel shy. Feel free to click the hand emoji or just write something on the chat or raise physically your hand, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and to ask the question or make the comment. Otherwise, I would appreciate it if you make sure to keep your microphones off so as not to disturb Jim. Uh, if you could also, of course, right before your intervention, if you have any question or comment, you could start the first time by introducing yourself. Just a couple of lines about your affiliation, where you're based, or anything of the sort. Because these roundtables are a great opportunity not just to learn about new and developing approaches to the topic, but also to acknowledge and get familiar with one another, because everyone here is as I mentioned in my email, I consider all of you my colleagues, professionals, academicians, practitioners working in this field, and so it's always a good opportunity to broaden this network. All right, so that's pretty much it from my side. Jim, the floor is yours. Feel free to start sharing your screen whenever you're ready. And if you could also say a little bit about yourself at the beginning, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Joseph, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks to you all for joining. I'm looking forward to hearing your views and discussion on this topic. So let me share here. Um, so the paper that we put together is called "Which Data Do Economists Use to Study Corruption?" And this is something that might seem quite obvious to many of you. Um, and in fact, I think um, a lot of people. Uh, sorry, let me just make sure. Can you see the screen at this point?
Not yet.
I turned it
It,
off. Okay, sorry.
it hasn't started sharing yet. Okay, now it's loading.
Okay, there it goes. Yeah.
Yes, great.
So hopefully you can see it now.
Yes.
So this is a policy research working paper, which is what the bank, a series the bank puts out. It's a working paper series. They're somewhat more academic in nature than the typical World Bank report. This one is academic, but in style, but a little more descriptive. It's not about hypothesis testing. It's more about surveying the landscape and giving some information about this question of which data economists use. So I'll start actually with a little bit of my own origin story, as they would say in the Marvel universe. How did I get to be studying this question? Why we did it the way we did it, some technical discussion about how we actually put together a data set to try to systematically answer this question, and then we'll get to some of the results. So, starting with a little about me and how I came to be interested in this question. So, I'm an economist by training. I was in the 1990s. I was working in Mongolia and did some work there on surveys of the informal sector and of privatized enterprises, and sort of a very interesting time. In 1997, I came back to the United States and joined the staff at the World Bank. And this was a very pivotal time for the bank. The picture on the far left is Jim Wolfenson, who was our president at the time, and he gave his famous Cancer of Corruption speech in 1996. And that really opened the door for the bank to talk about corruption much more openly as a development issue, and closed the door on this idea that it was somehow a political issue and therefore, beyond our mandate. And so that time after that speech, there was a lot of interest in the World Bank in trying to be able to say something more systematic and fact-based about corruption, about the problem itself and its causes, its manifestations, where it's worse, et cetera. And so there was a lot of interest in data at the time. Danny Kaufman was there and very active. Sanjay Pradhan, Randy Reiterman was the person who hired me into the bank. A lot of others, of course, Joel Hellman came to the bank in 2000 or 2001. But that period from 97, 98 up through the mid 2000s was quite an active period of time in terms of data collection related to corruption. So I put up here some of the things I was involved with. 1998 was this study on corruption in Latvia, and it was based on surveys of households, enterprises, and public officials. And that sort of triangulation, as Danny would call it, the triangulation was a model that we followed in many countries around the world. I did several of these in ECA countries, Europe and Central Asia. Other colleagues in the World Bank Institute did many others in other places around the world. In 2000, we put together Anti-Corruption and Transition, which ended up being a series of several reports over several years, but it was based on the BEPS, the Business Environment and Enterprise Performance Survey, which was done in Europe and Central Asia, together with the EBRD. Again, very much data oriented. In 2008, I kind of went away for a bit. So I went first to Vietnam and worked there for 6 years. I kept up this idea of using surveys to understand how people see corruption, how they experience it. So we did this study there on the right, corruption from the perspective of citizens, firms, and public officials. But I was a little farther away from Washington. And then 2014, I went to Mongolia again as a country manager. So I was not working on governance or anti-corruption per se, but on many things. And then 2018, I came back to Washington. And when I did, one of the things I found when sort of reacquainting myself with this area of work was that it felt like we really hadn't progressed very far in terms of data collection. I thought we would have been be further along. My colleague Alex Habershon put together this symposium on data analytics for anti-corruption, and this was with support from KDI, who I should have said at the beginning. KDI also supported the study that I'm presenting today. But we had this symposium. It was a hybrid format, and it was the first one, I think, or one of the very first ones after COVID, when we were allowed sort of to allow people back in the building, but it was still mostly online. But it was a little bit eye-opening in a good way, in that we it turns out there is a lot of interesting things going on in terms of data, and a lot more um, interesting and new approaches to data collections. Um, but what we wanted to do with this study was to be a little more systematic and say, okay, not just what's out there, what's available, but what actually gets used. So and thus the title, which data do economists use to study corruption? We wanted to be systematic. We know there are lots of different types of data available: composites, expert opinions, surveys, experiments. Are there others? Maybe there would be others that would turn up in this research. So that was the one of the objectives, was just to get a lay of the land. Um, and we also wanted to learn something more about how the data is used for different types of studies. So, for example, geographical focus, purpose of the study, whether it's looking at corruption as a cause of something else or the causes of corruption. And also, uh, kind of central early on was this question about which fields of economics were the ones that were most active in using data on corruption for their research. And then finally, learn a little bit about how economics research is different from other fields, and that's a work in progress, a little bit speculative. I'll talk more about that at the end. So in order to be systematic, we wanted to not just try to collect as large a number of papers as we could, but really come up with a well-defined cross section. So we wanted, and that means defining in a way exactly what your search criteria are, and how you come up with that. So we use this EBSCOhost and EconLit databases. EBSCOhost is a bit broader, and it actually includes EconLit. But EconLit is also its own database that can be searched upon. And we picked them primarily because they're available. They're widely known and used, and they're available at the IMF World Bank Library System. And we started with a search. So it was in 2022. We wanted to limit ourselves to journal articles, publications in English, and articles where the word corruption appears in the abstract. So, and we didn't use any proxies or alternative terms. So in a way, it's very limiting. So it certainly does not include some papers that might be about corruption in some way, but don't use the word corruption. But we figure most of the time, if corruption is an important issue for the paper, they'll use the word in the abstract. And this came up with, in this 1 year, a universe of 882 papers, of which 339 had JEL codes. I'll talk about that in a minute. And of those, 270 had used data. I see your hand up, Joseph.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to ask you about any quality criteria used here. So but a few years back in 2020, I conducted a systematic review using machine learning of about between 5,000, 6,000 papers. Well, we only look at the abstracts. And working off the list that had been compiled by Matthew Stevenson from Harvard. So at that moment, the quality we consider the quality criteria to have been handled by the person who originally created the list of papers, right? We mostly just analyze the data. More recently, though, for a different paper, we're looking for to identify documents related to corruption tolerance. And at that point, because we were doing it from scratch, the question is what was for us, okay, even if we just consider journal articles, right? Should we look for or be careful with potentially predatory journals or journals that are fairly unknown to the rest of the field, for example? And we had a little bit of a discussion about that. So I'm wondering if that's something that also is an issue here. I am not that familiar with EBSCO, so if you could say something about it.
Yeah, so it is an expansive list. And I actually have some slides on the quality question, how we dealt with that in just a few minutes. So if it's okay, I'll talk about that in just a minute. So but
Great,
before
thank
we
you.
get there though, so we have one of the criteria was the JEL codes. So we wanted papers and this was initially one of the, as I said, one of the main topics of interest was, which parts of economics are using data the most, and maybe we'll learn something interesting there. The JEL codes are JEL stands for Journal of Economic Literature. And this is a system of codes that has its roots over 100 years ago, but the modern system dates back to 1990. It's still widely used by economists anyway, widely used to index and sort of give an idea, hey, this is a paper that's in the area of public economics, or this is in political economy and comparative economic systems, maybe, or something like that. They have both the overall um, letter, which is sort of the top level. It's kind of like SIC. You can have multiple digits, but there's also a more granular level. And one of the challenges that we found. So I'll tell you the challenge before I get to the results here. One of the challenges that we found that made this not as easy. And there are several things that made this whole data collection a much longer process than I originally anticipated. My colleague Akanksha, I think, is connected and co-author, and we were both um, puzzling over some of these things as we went through. But one issue with the JEL codes that we learned is that they're not always consistent. In fact, they're almost always inconsistent. So, so for example, here's just one that I picked more or less at random. If you look at the JEL codes assigned in the EconLit database, they are completely different from the ones that actually appear on the article. And that this was true pretty much across the board. To try to get an idea of how systematic it was, just a kind of quick look. We looked at 13 papers in the Google Scholar top 20 economics journals, and all of them had different sets of codes between the actual published paper and what is in the EconLit database. Uh, but it turns out that others have also, looked into and studied the use of these JEL codes because they're so widely used, and they found that while they're often, not consistent in approach, they do broadly reflect the topics of research. That it's not a random thing, and so we thought they're still somewhat useful. So the papers. Um, that were done from our sample. The most common areas that were covered were microeconomics, that's D there, and economic development, innovation, technological change, and growth. That the one microeconomics is actually the only one that has a sub area that uses the word corruption. Um, Interesting also, of course, public economics was third there. Financial economics was next. One thing, a little bit of a surprise to me was that there was so much being written in the area of financial economics, some of which I hadn't been aware of because there are different journals from the ones that I would typically come across. If you look at the more narrow categories. Of course, the most popular one was the one with the word corruption in the name, which is D73 covers bureaucracy, administrative processes, and corruption, followed by formal, informal sector, shadow economy, and institutional arrangements. But the full list, so this only goes down to the ones with at least 15 papers picking that code. And the full list would be very, very long. So another takeaway is that it's not a narrow field of research by any stretch. Study of corruption cuts across every single broad category of the JEL codes and a huge number of the narrow ones as well. Okay, now the question of quality, as Joseph asked. So we also found not only journals we'd never heard of, which is not surprising and doesn't necessarily mean anything bad about those journals. I think sometimes small journals can be super interesting. But in looking at the papers themselves, we could quickly see that they were of really variable quality. So, and the ones that were most surprising, I think. So our mission when we pulled up these papers, the 339 papers, we had to look at the paper, we had to, tag what source of data was being used, how it was being used, all these sorts of things. And the ones where we couldn't tell were the ones we were most worried about in terms of quality. So if you're not sure what is the source of data, or you're not sure how corruption figures into the equation that's being tested, then it feels like a lower quality. We didn't do any effort to use our subjective judgment to cut out lower quality, quote unquote, papers. So we didn't determine what is high quality, what is low quality, but we wanted something that is more objective. So two sources that we came up with for journal rankings. So since we were using journals, we thought we would trust the journal editors and peer reviewers to do a good job of saying, okay, this reaches the certain quality standard. So two journal rankings we used for this are the Combs and Linamer 2010, which ranks 600 journals in economics, but also brings in a few from other fields that often that may not be considered economics journals, but are often used by economists. And the others is the Ideas RepEc H Index for journals. And that one is a bit more dynamic. I think they update it monthly, which was another challenge. So we had to pick a date and say and use those ranks. So one measure of quality is, were the journals ranked at all by one or the other of these? And second, were the journals ranked in the top 100 by one or the other of these? So we weren't really looking for the really top general interest journals, because often, as I said, interesting papers are not in general interest journals. Often they're in more narrow targeted journals. We also did a little bit of work using the Google Scholar Top 20, which is also dynamic. It's based on their Google Scholar data, and it's updated periodically. We didn't use it consistently through the study because it's a much smaller number of papers in those, because it's only 20 in those top 20 journals. But we do come back to that in some later analysis. So there's just the list of the top 100 by either ranking. So sorry, that's not the full list of 100. Obviously, these are the top 100 journals that had at least one study in our sample. Joseph, go ahead.
Thank you. I wonder if we can combine a couple of questions because I have one and I think Andrew also had another question. So if Andrew would like to just ask it directly, let me go first. Uh, so thank you for explaining that quality control. That makes perfect sense to me. Uh, I was also wondering from a previous perspective about the decision of focusing specifically on academic journals, right? Because I would imagine that specifically taking an economics approach, that there would be a number of World Bank reports or reports by the IMF and other international organizations that also engage with corruption data. So I was wondering if this was considered, what would have been the pros or cons of including them, and how you reached the decision. So that would be my question. Andrew, would you like to ask yours?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, James. Fascinating presentation so far. Just two questions I had that are sort of emerging. The first one was, why did you limit the review to 2022 year, so just one single year rather than a range of years? And then the other one was your focus on economic literature rather than the broader papers. We're doing systematic literature reviews at the moment. We're using Scopus database. We have 45,000 papers on that database. And the percentages are about, economic journals are only comprising about 15%. The rest, so the majority are in the social science papers. So just your comments on why did you focus only on the economic journals as well? So two questions: economic journals and the year 2022. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, two good questions. So on the why limit to journals, partially because if you expand it to books and reports, you have the challenge that it's not as well defined a universe. So you're certainly, I mean, even like making it well defined, saying, let's look at World Bank reports, which would be quite a lot. Um, we have huge number of things that come out as a report. They're not indexed in the same sources. So one challenge would be if we said, okay, let's look at reports done by international organization, we'd have to essentially set up a way to search every international organization's public archives and determine what qualified as a report. Um, and on top of all of this is just the practical issue of this is a lot of a lot to do. So, because for each one, once they come up in a search, you still need to get a copy of the paper report and pull it up and read through and identify the things you want to identify and make some judgments. Is it a study about the cause of corruption or corruption as a cause of something else? What are the sources of corruption data used, et cetera? So we wanted to make it as well defined and starting with a defined search. So books, we could have done the same thing. I mean, we could have included books. I'm I'm not sure in those databases how um, complete, I guess, the collection. So, at what point does a report become a book? So I think a lot of our book, I usually use the very unscientific definition that if we put a glossy cover on it and print it and it's typeset, then we call it a book. Um, it has a copyright page and all of that kind of thing, but it wouldn't necessarily come up in a search. And like I said, we we were trying to have something that was fairly well defined, um, rather than just trying to like add in, oh, here's another paper that we came across. And so you might be familiar with Matthew Stevenson's bibliography. which is, I think, October 2022 was the last time he updated it, and it was more than 700 pages long. And it was just a bibliography. It's not like it had abstracts or anything. It's just a list of things. And actually, even using that, so the World Bank reports typically are not in there. And so it's a huge undertaking. And to do it in a way that is more well defined, we thought would be the best way to go. And that's why we say in the subtitle of the paper, we say it's a cross section of corruption research. So why, Andrew, question why 2022? So yeah, I mean, partially just being practical. So what would be interesting also would be to know practical in the sense that it's a lot of work to do this, and we could expand to other years, but that would require more labor power, maybe something for a future study. We just wanted to look at a cross section. Would be interesting to also see over time if it's changed at all, but like I said, that's also quite a lot more work. And yeah, it would be a much bigger sample if we had other years. We started doing another year, but decided let's do one thing pretty well, and then we'll see if we want to expand it. So why economics and JEL codes? So a very good question. In a way, it's we wanted to know how the papers were classified according to the JEL system, and that ended up narrowing it. We do come back to this question later about how economics is different from the others. And we'll come back. I'll come back towards the end to this 882 papers. So that was the broader search, which whether or not they had JEL codes. So I'll come back to that question. Okay, so then getting to the question of the title of the paper, which data is actually used. We didn't search on data types. We searched on papers on corruption and then looked for the data types. So we let the data types that are being used reveal themselves. The things that came up tended to be composites, the Worldwide Governance Indicators, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, a number of different surveys, expert opinions, especially ICRG and VDEM, and some other sources not used quite as frequently. We also had some that were more one-off or specific to a particular country, maybe. A couple from Vietnam there. I worked in Vietnam quite a bit, so I'm familiar with this, but it came up in the search simply because data is available, this Provincial Competitiveness Index and the PAPI. Also a number of experiments, role-playing games, cheating games, administrative data, prosecutions, investigations, a lot of event studies. So that's sort of, before and after something happened, how did things look different? Audit reports and media reports. So in terms of how frequently they're being used, the most commonly used sources were the Worldwide Governance Indicators, Control of Corruption, TI's Corruption Perceptions Index, and all the others in much smaller numbers. Administrative data, quite a number of countries there as well. This is the number of papers, and other surveys included surveys that were not as, that were more country specific rather than cross country. Is that David?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for the for your presentation. Actually, I actually read the paper. Actually, I've seen it when it came out, and then I find it quite interesting. So thank you for the work. I just want to know what you actually think, concerning this finding, particularly given the first finding here that that the two most used data of TICPI and the World Bank indicators, because the two data are kind of correlated. So and then that can kind of connect with the central argument of to what extent do they actually reflect the overall corruption. So I just want to hear your perspective, whether you are surprised about the finding firstly, then again whether you finding this, if a lot of researchers are actually using it, isn't that saying that these data actually they have quality, and then it can be relied upon for as a good indicator for corruption?
Um, yeah, so I was in some ways surprised, in some ways not surprised. So I was not surprised um, that there were all these different sources. I wasn't surprised the worldwide governance indicators are widely used. I should say also coming back to the papers themselves. So our criteria is corruption in the abstract, and um, was data used on corruption for most of these. So the 339 didn't require that it was empirical. Some of those were theoretical. But if you get down to like the 270 that actually use data on corruption, um, a lot of them might have been, corruption was not really the main focus of the paper. It's something else. They're looking, they have some other dependent variable and some other variable of interest, and they want to control for corruption. But it's important enough that they put it in the abstract. So we left those in. We were trying to avoid subjective judgments. Was I surprised that these were being used to the extent that they were? Um, I was not too surprised, a little bit disappointed.
Mm.
Not that, not in, in some cases, like the ones I was just talking about, where they just want to, they're looking at something else, and they want to, this researcher wants a convenient cross-country measure of corruption to control for that. And so they pick what's available, what's easy. That doesn't surprise me as much, but I was hoping to see more in the way of innovation, which doesn't mean that there wasn't. There were a lot of very interesting papers in this sample, but the widespread use of the big composites um, was sometimes disappointing to me. Um, the so and I a lot of times people would so the researcher, in explaining why they picked that variable, they would say, well, it's used by many others. So it's sort of self-fulfilling, people use it because many others use it. And they're very popular, they're very convenient, they're very well known. You don't have to explain too much, and I think most people are not interested unfortunately, in the details. Maybe the people in this meeting would be different in that respect, because we are interested in the details, but I think many researchers would not be. But I'll come back also to some more of the
Uh,
reflections.
before you go, also, I will like you to actually comment, maybe illuminate more around the administrative data, because I can see it's quite substantial also.
Yeah, yeah, I'll talk more about. I have quite a few more slides, so I'll talk more about each of the specific types. Katrina?
Hello, thank you. Very, very fascinating. I'm Katarina Group. For those who don't know me, I'm from Åbo Akademi University in Finland. And currently I'm working as a corruption researcher, but I also have a history as a public official in anti-corruption. And my question is related. It's very fascinating to see the extent to which these big composites, indicators are being used. And I was wondering, and I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on the usage of these, because there's been quite a lot of criticism against these measures, and there have been a lot of calls for to combine, at least combine these indicators or these measures with qualitative data. And is this something that you looked upon at all as part of your project? The extent to which qualitative data was being used and combined with these quantitative measures.
Thanks. So combine. So in this paper, we didn't look at. We were pretty much just were mechanically going into the papers and saying, okay, what was the source of corruption data that was used? There were quite a few papers that were empirical in a way, but not data driven per se, which used more like case studies, focus group type analysis. It's still empirical. I mean, it's still about learning from the real world, but it wasn't data driven per se. So those would be, sort of not categorized in any of these ways. Certainly, whenever we write reports, we would not simply take any indicator, and not just the composites, but even the others, and just sort of blindly put that in. The World Bank Enterprise Surveys, which is the successor to the BEEPs that I talked about, that I was involved with 20 some years ago, is a survey of firms, and I think it's great and it's underutilized, but you still have caveats about it. And so you definitely need any discussion of the findings would need to have a mix of the data, which is useful for giving some benchmarks, but also with qualitative information and assessments as well. My preference, if I'm doing research, I wrote a paper in 2009 on governance and anti-corruption indicators in East Asia and Pacific, where I unpacked the worldwide governance indicators quite a bit and looked at some of the issues that that have been raised by others, going all the way back to 2007 or so. Arndt and Oman, I think, and OECD, and my colleague Steve Knack, the World Bank, also wrote some critiques back then about the mixing together of indicators in different amounts from different countries and different periods of time, and you end up with something that's really much harder to define. So my feeling has always been that, for the study where you just want something on the right-hand side of a regression equation to capture corruption, but it's not really your main topic of interest, then, it's convenient. I don't know, it's worse than others, but my preference would be to use sources of data where you can say much more precisely what it means or how it's defined. So in the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, a question about, how often do firms like yours pay bribes? So, you can define that. Okay, according to a survey that asks this question, and here's the answer. Afrobarometer, also a number of questions. it's so most of the ones that are not composite, it's a little easier to define exactly what you're looking at. And so my preference when I write reports is to use those other types of sources of data where I can write up, you know, uh, what something is. Um, Let me move ahead. So this is the sort of top line answer to the question, which data do economists use? Joseph, you have another?
Yes, very quickly here, because by the way, this is an incredibly interesting finding. I have so many comments, but I just have a quick question. So the second one is the CPI, but I'm not seeing here the global corruption barometer. Am I missing something?
It's not inaccurate. Your observation is accurate. You're not missing anything in that sense, but I'll get to that in my final reflections
All right.
also.
Okay.
So that was a surprise. So when one of my takeaways is why some good sources of data are either not used or hardly used. One paper using Afrobarometer, and global corruption barometer, none in this cross section. Of course, if you looked at World Bank reports, so here the earlier question on why excluding books and reports is important. If you looked at World Bank reports, you'd see tons with Afrobarometer, Global Corruption Barometer, all of these other sources. But in this cross section, economics published journal articles, it seems that people went for what was quick and easy and available. You don't need to scratch your head over too much. Um, and um, and so that's the way it came out. So let me show you some of the breakdowns. So this is the overall result. One of the type of breakdowns we did was according to whether the subject was covered the world, whether it was a particular region, affinity studies. Some studies were about BRICS countries, oil exporters, a particular treaty member, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, these sorts of things, OPEC, affinity group. And then there are also country specific and comparative. But just looking first at the world, regional, and affinity, you'll see, of course, if you're covering the world, then you want comparable data across the world. You want large numbers of observations. So here, the dominance of the composites is even more obvious. Much less use of administrative data, which would be harder to put together, and harder to make comparable across countries. If you look at single geography studies, so studies of a single country or a particular part of a country, or what we call comparative studies, or ones with 2 or 3 countries, then a researcher that's doing that is going to need data that is you still need a lot of observations. So you need either larger countries with subdivisions. Of course, you need, so if you're using administrative data, so here administrative data is much more common for a study of a single geography, or surveys, specific to those countries. And the big composites are less common. In some cases, it was hard to categorize the papers. So, for example, a study of Chinese and Indian investment in the African continent, using FDI data or something. And so we did the best we could. They weren't a lot, but there were quite a lot of, if you look at absolute numbers, you go back the absolute numbers of studies using the composites was still pretty big, but they're much less useful for looking at issues within a particular country. So for the single geography studies, the countries that that were used, so all the ones in that kind of purplish color were ones that had at least one, and we highlighted some of the ones with large numbers. China and the US were the ones with the most studies, and a very large number for China. China, it was mostly a matter of topical interest. So this was another surprise to me that there was so much research being done. Much of it was in the form of an event study, so looking at the dates and implementation of the anti-corruption program in China, and then looking at how it affected some other variable of interest. It could be stock prices, poverty, firm performance. A lot of studies on firm performance in the USA. There are studies of corruption and tax avoidance, corruption and trust, impact on investment, how oil-rich states compare to others. Russia had one on oil windfalls and inequality. But one of the things that you'll note is if you look at, again, with all the caveats that go with this, that we're looking at economics journal articles, not the whole world of research. But the countries that are getting the studies are not necessarily the ones that have the corruption problems. They're the ones that meet the criteria a researcher would need. So if you're looking at a single country, bigger countries are easier because you have more subdivisions and you get enough observations. And time series data is useful there as well. Coming back to the quality question, so we did some breakdowns of how all empirical studies versus those that were ranked by the two different ranking systems. So here's the first ranking systems, the CL index. One of the things that you note is that as you move from all studies to the journals that are indexed by them to the top 100 that are indexed by them, you'll see that there are relatively fewer use of composites for the higher ranked journals, relatively more use of administrative data and experiments. And a similar sort of picture when you look at the other ranking system. So the composites, worldwide governance indicators, and CPI made up about half of all the empirical studies used those. But if you look in the ones that were published in RepEc top 100 journals, which is a smaller number, of course, 24 journals, but they were about a quarter of the higher ranked journals. And higher ranked journals were much more likely to be using administrative data. The question of whether the study was looking at corruption as a cause of something else or an effect, the largest number of studies, 69%, were looking at corruption as a cause for something else. So the example I put there was corruption's effect on vaccination rates. Of course, lots of studies on investment and growth. How does corruption hinder investment and growth? 24% looked at the causes of corruption. Example I picked was, effect of state history on corruption. Some did both. So these are ones, so the one I picked there was impact of corruption on tax evasion, and of tax evasion on corruption, and Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. So pretty well-known journal. Those are the papers where they, have to work out the simultaneous equations to be able to say something about these about both directions of causality, and then some didn't either, like legal reviews. What are the sources of data that are being used? You still corruption as a cause of something else, still, and even more so, use of the big composites, studies examining the causes of corruption. The composites individually are not as important as administrative data. I would not use the composites to analyze the causes of corruption personally. Maybe as a cause for something else. Now, coming back to this question of how economics compares to other disciplines. So we did focus on the papers with JEL codes, and then but we wanted to explore about the other papers, so the ones that were in our universe but didn't have JEL codes. And to do this, without having to actually open up 800. Oh, sorry. Eva had a question?
Yes. Hi. I just wanted to very quickly ask something. I hope you can hear me.
I hear you fine. Thanks.
Perfect. Just about your previous slides on the type of studies that you identified in terms of corruption as a cause of something or the causes of corruption. I didn't see a box on anything on anti-corruption, so the effect of various either pilots or reforms policies. And I would assume that in the economics literature, especially, there should be quite a lot of causal studies trying to estimate the effect of policies or interventions like this. So I was wondering, did you not find any studies looking at this, at anti-corruption?
No, there are certainly studies on anti-corruption. I'm trying to remember how we treated those. So in many cases, it was there were studies of, so whether a policy is working or not, or what is the effect of an anti-corruption type policy on something else. We classified that as corruption's impact on something else. Because it's not really about the determinants of anti-corruption policies. I should say also, so again, one of the delimiting factors for our search is the word corruption in the abstract. So if a paper, if there was a paper saying, how does a code of ethics impact morale or something like that, then that wouldn't show up in our search unless they used the word corruption in there. But yes, there were definitely papers on anti-corruption. We just didn't separately classify them. Which maybe we could have. You can always add more dimensions and things that you would like to add in, other dimensions, and that I think that would be a good candidate. So on the comparison to other literatures, here this is where we use the Google Scholar indices, and the reason we did that is to try to find something that was comparable between economics and other disciplines, and Google Scholar has a top 20 list of journals for different disciplines, and the three disciplines we looked at were economics, political science, and public policy and administration. And looking at the top 20 journals in each, and going back to that original set of 882 or thereabouts papers. So the other disciplines, political science and public policy and administration, actually have many more papers than in the top 20 economics journals. Of course, very few had none of the ones in political science journals used JEL codes, so they all ended up excluded from our sample, and very few in public policy and administration journals used JEL codes, but they did use data. So we were a bit speculative at this point, but there was the feeling that the disciplines might be a bit siloed, and particularly if economists, are focusing on searching using JEL codes, then they're going to be missing out quite a lot. One of the things we did out of curiosity was take a look at the citations in the papers. As you can imagine, that this is a great deal more work. So it involves pulling up a paper and looking at citations and then determining whether they are citing an economics discipline source or political science discipline source. And to make it a little more manageable, we said, okay, let's look only at the papers that are in the top 20 economics journals and see if they cite papers in the top 20 political science journals or in the top 20 PPA journals. And in fact, what is it? Out of the 15 in economics journals, only 6 cited any papers in the top political science journals, and none cited any papers in the top 20 public policy and administration journals. So this is a possible avenue for future research of, just how siloed we are. But we'd have to come up with a better way of examining these citations to make it a practical exercise, or hire lots of research assistants to do it. So what to make of all this? I think we've already covered some of this as we've gone along, but the study of corruption is booming. Lots of papers. So 800 and some in the initial search. That's what, a few each day a paper is coming out. Composite indicators are widely used, despite long-known criticism. Surveys, which, have their own issues, but some are very well known and are hardly used at all. And they're thinking particularly about the Global Corruption Barometer, but also Afrobarometer, World Value Survey, the World Bank Enterprise Survey, and Life and Transition Survey were in there, but in pretty small numbers. There were a few news sources to me, so I thought that was interesting, including ones looking at media reports. Top journals are relatively more likely to publish studies using administrative or experimental data, and they're more likely to publish studies on the causes of corruption on the causes of corruption rather than corruption's impact on something else. Data availability is driving the research topic. I think that's a clear conclusion. And the bottom line, the world needs to focus more on original data and causes of corruption, not as much on composites and studies of the impacts. And that's it. So there's the paper itself is available online. I should say also that for policy research working papers at the World Bank now, there's a requirement that a reproducibility package be made available. So that includes the data and the code for generating all of the tables in the paper, and that's available.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think for now we kind of stop sharing. Yes, great. Of course, if anybody have any question that requires to go back to the slides, that will be fine. So of course I would like to open the floor for anyone that would like to share their comments, ask questions. Let me just get the ball rolling, because especially that last slide where you where you kind of summarize the different conclusions, based on what you found. A lot of them reverberate with me. They really echo some of the concerns that I had, I should say. Let me just start with one that I think was a very powerful line at the very end about how data availability drives the choice of research topic, which is something that I'm sure a lot of colleagues have kind of sensed in the past, right? It's impossible not to notice, and of course, there are conversations for anybody that has students. That's something that we try to inculcate in them, the fact that you have to choose a topic and then find the data or collect data that makes sense for that to answer that research topic and not the other way around, right? Uh, and it's a little disheartening to see that, yes, what we were seeing actually is that we just continue using the same traditional data sources because they are popular, not necessarily because they are the best. Uh, and that takes me to the first question that I wanted to ask in this section. Then I'll hand it to Fabiano. Um, Perhaps this is almost a silly question, but did you very often get the feeling while reviewing these papers, because you had it already an image of the landscape of data sources, that when you're going through a paper, you think to yourself, oh, they're taking again the CPI, where potentially they could have chosen this other data that is available as well and would have fitted their purpose a lot better. Was that something that happened to you?
Um, well, I certainly um, I guess it would depend on the topic of the paper. So there were times when I would see like a composite. So there are times when a composite's being used, like I said, on the right-hand side of an equation where it's not really the subject of interest, and they're being pragmatic and saying, well, we need something covering a lot of countries, and here's what we picked. I don't have as much of a problem with that. The ones where they are trying to determine what is causing corruption, either across nationally or sometimes even within a country where they would use a composite. Then I would say, that's just not, that's not what I would do. The Yeah, so sometimes I definitely did have that reaction. But I think one other thing to note, and I know many others have observed this as well, but our statistical analysis, econometrics sort of training, makes us want to, of course, have lots of observations. And in the world, we have, a couple hundred countries. So we're sort of, and that we also implicitly or explicitly um, uh, make the assumption that the institutions, the framework, the context, everything at a country level is sufficiently homogeneous that we can attach one number to describe the level of corruption, or could be many other variables. Doesn't have to be about corruption, but that we do these cross-country studies, and you have one number describing China or India or United States, some enormous countries, and there's something implicit, and I do this too. We do this in our kind of benchmarking, but we shouldn't do only that, right? We need to, so the papers that I read that were more interesting to me were the ones within a country where they're looking at variations, so that because they have all the same overall legal framework at the top level, but there's some variation in, political connections to firms, say, across provinces in this country. And that I think that's a much more interesting topic to me than the cross-country studies. And like I said, I've done cross-country studies myself, so I understand why researchers like to do that, and they want to come up with some findings that have some general applicability. You improve rule of law, you're going to have less corruption, whatever the story you want to come up with. But in the end, when you're doing a cross-country study, you're making all kinds of assumptions and really asking that one number for a large country to do a lot of work. And you better have a lot of confidence in that one number.
Great, thanks.
Sorry.
Fabiano.
Oh, thank you, James, for the presentation. And thanks again, Joseph, for organizing this, for convening this. So my name is Fabiano Angelico. I am a researcher at the University of Lugano here in Switzerland. And I have recently conducted a research project on open government data uses to study corruption. I presented this here, I think 1 year ago or a bit less. And that's why I'm interested, James, in your conceptualization of administrative data and which data sets specifically, which kind of administrative data you found most in your research. I mean, the data set types most frequently used in this universe of administrative data. Thanks again.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question, and we also got some comment. I think we shared it before we put it out as a working paper with a few people, and similar sort of question of whether we're, giving the best name to this. But we've included in that category data that is not survey-based, that is something that you could, in a sense, look up and see the answer. So it really has a mix of different types of things in there. So in some cases it was data on the most obvious would be like corruption prosecutions, corruption convictions, corruption investigations,
court data, audit
I
data.
think, yeah, audit data. So all of those, I think, fit pretty well in how we, imagine the word administrative data. But other things would be like position of politicians on boards of companies or things that is found. So it's fact-based. And so I called that administrative. It's not government administrative, but we called that administrative. And yet another that comprised quite a lot was the event studies that I mentioned. So a lot of studies, particularly in China, on what is the impact of the anti-corruption program. And so the date is essentially the date is the key indicator there. And it's a matter of, fact that you can look up. Here is the date when certain policies took effect. And then some of them, link it together with, how much it was implemented at the province level. So, when the policies were rolled out at the province level. And so you get some variation over time and over across provinces. And so that's, useful for a researcher. But we included that as administrative data, kind of for lack of a better place to put it. So I think one thing that might be useful if we have the energy and the time would be to unpack a little better and not just call it all administrative data, but break down those studies into some sort of subcategories or dimensions. And this also relates, I think, to the earlier question on anti-corruption as well. But yeah, so it's kind of a mix of stuff that's in there. Thanks.
David?
Yeah, thank you very much, James. In the paper itself, I think you listed out some journals, rank them according to how much of this paper that were published in the using this data set. So I just want to know, firstly, what is the direction you are taking next, over this paper? Are you planning to extend this work maybe to compare across some other field or disciplines that studies corruption? For instance, in the journals that you listed, quite a number of the journals are political science journals. So, and then if there are political science, I know there could be methodological, differences and, all the way, empirical work is carried out across fields. But, are you thinking about maybe probably enlarging these studies to actually compare across some fields, across some fields?
Yeah, good question. That's definitely something we've thought about. Not something I've started work on other than as I mentioned a little bit on taking a look at how siloed the disciplines are. So and certainly the lack of inclusion of political science and public administration journal research in the economics papers is something that surprised me. I don't know if it's true the other way, because I haven't looked into it enough. Something I would be interested in doing, of course, it's always a question of work program and time. I'm actually this work was started when I was in the global unit and focused on anti-corruption. Now I'm in East Asia and working on governance more broadly, and so it's always a question of time to be able to do it. But I think that's definitely a question worth looking into, is looking at the other disciplines. And I did make the point, as you saw in the paper, that economists, for something like corruption, which is really cross-disciplinary, it's a mistake to be siloed and to not look in these other literatures. So one example, so one of the papers in the economics list, I can't remember which one, but it was talking about politics in the title, and it was in a top economics journal, and I don't think they cited any political science journals in the citation list. Unless you call like Journal of Political Economy, but I think of that as an economics journal, not a political science journal, but obviously has the word political in the title. So, but anyway, David, I think that's a good suggestion and a worthy area for examination.
Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, James. Just a comment, or actually more of a plug for data sources that I didn't actually see on that list. I know it was only for 2022, but there are 4 data sources that we at Dublin City University used that weren't on that list. The first one was the GFS database, so the spending by sector and economic classification for every country. The second one is World Development Indicators. That's sort of a go-to data set for various statistical measures. Then PIFA is another one which we use as proxies for problems in procurement and payroll and things like that. And then one which we're very interested in, it's hard to get a publication out of, is all that confidential internal data that's on government systems. So we've got access to a lot of payroll, granular accounting data, tax data, customs data, and contracts data. And when you start to see that, that's like the gold standard for looking at these sorts of areas. So I'll just put a plug for those 4 data sources as well.
Thanks. Yeah, that's very helpful, and it's also gives me a chance to give another explanation or caveat of what we looked at. So one of the challenges we faced also was oftentimes a study will use lots of data sources. So there were quite a lot that used world development indicators for something, GDP, for investment, for whatever. I mean, they cover so many things. But we really tried to focus on the data source that was used for corruption, or if it was something else, if it was being like presented as a proxy for corruption, then we would include that. But some of the others, and this relates also to the earlier question on anti-corruption. So, PIFA is certainly very, very useful, and I use it quite a bit. But is it being used? A question for a particular paper, is it being used as a proxy for corruption, or is it just a proxy for, good PFM system or something like that? And so it might not have been in our paper, even if, PIFA is included in the actual studies that are being examined. But yeah, good plug so sorry, which institution were you from?
Dublin City University in Ireland.
Okay.
Amira.
Thank you so much, James, for the presentation and the paper. I went through the paper. It's really a good paper. My name is Amira Gamaluddin, and I'm a researcher in governance and policy expert from Egypt. And I just want to comment on the data sources. I think one of the reasons that behind using the WGIs and the CPI in the papers like that, these sources are coming from big organizations, and where people trust the sources, despite the fact that there is lots of criticism regarding the data sources of the WGI and CPI as well. Also, there is another problem related to the admin records or the admin data. For example, a country like Egypt, we don't have the Freedom of Information law, which at the same time influences the availability of data. So that's why most of people in Egypt, when studying governance or corruption, resort to the idea of these big composite or the composite indices, because these indices provide them with data. So also for researching the causes of corruption, I think we need to have specific focus on the qualitative methods, because I think when it comes to the causes of corruption, there are lots of behavioral aspects involved, and cultural and societal aspects involved, and we need to take into considerations these aspects when it comes to the causes of corruption. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Yeah, excellent comments. And the availability of admin data also was a key point that we made.
Jim, so we still have a couple of minutes. So I wanted to ask you, so what do we have now for the future? So what would be the next project? What do you have in mind now?
So I guess I'll answer the question for the big U, which is the World Bank. We actually are trying within our our group. So we used to be called the Governance Global Practice. Now we've been renamed institutions. And within that group, there's a recognition that we need to step up our game in terms of data, not about corruption per se, but data related to institutions and governance. And we actually have a new unit, which I'm not part of, but some very good people over there also working on building more of a data observatory type approach. For me personally, I got into this. It was as a sort of coda or second act after the symposium, and with support from KDI, because we just a longstanding interest in the topic. So most of our work, of course, is at the country level. And at the country level, we do, depending on the country, we might do some original data collection, or we might, use available data. So I'm lucky to be working in Vietnam. As I mentioned, there are two good sources that make the work a little easier, because they had until recently 63 provinces, which is enough to do something interesting, and also possibility of getting respondent level data is useful. But what's next for me personally, in terms of this area of research? So there are a couple of things I'm interested in. I don't know when I'll have time to do it because it's not part of my my work program. I had a meeting right before this with one of our with my colleagues in one of our country offices about something else, which with more of a deadline. We all know how that is. The ones with the deadlines get the attention. But the things that I think are interesting from an analytical perspective would be some of the things that we talked about, comparing the disciplines, and unpacking the admin data classification a bit, possibly extending to other years. I think those are all interesting questions, but in a way, I think the main, implications are already known without more research. So, and I think what the paper did in a way was put some numbers and systematic examination to be able to say some things that I think many people felt anyway. But this need for investing, I still feel that there should be relatively more attention to developing better and more innovative data, rather than finding a new algorithm to rehash what already exists. But like I said, also that if you look at the bar chart and you see, a lot of papers are in this category, not very inventive, but there were some very interesting papers in there too. And so in the paper, we quoted some of the experimental work. I find that interesting.
Great. Yes, as you said, it's always good to be able to put numbers at things that we may perceive or perhaps have an intuition about. But to be able to see it in a graph that is not debatable anymore at that point, that not just reflects the dominance of certain indicators, but also provides certain surprises, and the one that you found about the global corruption barometer. I was also surprised about the little use of the Basel AML index, for example, because I find it to be, without much competition specifically for what they do, and yet it doesn't seem to be to be very popular, especially at least among economists in that cross section, right? So thank you again for sharing these insights with us. I mean, we have the report, but it's different to be able to hear it from the author themselves, and to be able to ask this question and get a feeling of why certain methodological choices went in that direction, and it's completely different. So you've been very kind with your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you everyone that joined us today, and especially those of you who are potentially getting close or having reached midnight. It's almost midnight here as well. I know how that feels. I hope to be able to see you all again for the next roundtable, and that's it from me. Thank you again, Jim. Have a great day. Take good care.
Thanks, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Not at all.